Welcome to Lesson 17, the final lesson on Cold War. This is why did the USSR and the Warsaw Pact fall? So, in other words, why did the Cold War end when it did? As usual, and as always, my trusted companion here, Mr. Suter.
And my fitness consigliere, Mr. Rain.
Buongiorno.
So, recap from last lesson. Gorbachev has been making a number of reforms. Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost and Perestroika were genuinely liberalizing, and actually they came from a good place. Remember that Gorbachev is not trying to make the world more capitalist because he likes capitalism. He's trying to save communism by making it more popular, which needs more political openness and economic change so it can give people the quality of life that there is in the West.
And the really big thing on that is that economic change. The Soviet Union was crippled under the weight of its own system. The Soviet system couldn't adapt to the technological changes of the modern world. There's a whole argument that the sort of computizing of technology meant that the Soviet Union had to advance in technology quicker than the United States, which was developing computers by private industry. But the Soviets were a little bit behind that, and the Soviet system was less flexible for adapting to rapid technological improvement.
It's a little bit of a biased capitalist pig dog North American perspective, but that's I know.
But from the horse's mouth, the Soviet Union was really faced with the choice. Talked to some ex-Soviet officials at the time. They were really hesitant of joining the computer age because it meant a lack of control. But all that said, what you really need to know more than anything else is that the economy of the Soviet Union, by comparison to the United States, was struggling. It was behind in overall production, it wasn't earning enough money, and it was embroiled, or the Soviet Union that was, in a very, very expensive war in Afghanistan that it could scarcely afford in the 1980s.
As a result of all of this, we see a massive decrease in the lifestyle and living standards of East Germans and East Polish people, and also Russians, throughout this entire period from about 1968, 69 onwards. The thing was, if you have glasnost, which is the end of censorship, or at least some type of censorship, opening to the West in terms of you're able to see and talk about what's going on in the West, people can see that now difference, that difference in lifestyle, that economic difference between East and West, which makes people go, you know what, the West is right, and therefore encourages people to desire for reform. The problem with that is, now that you let people publicly criticize things and discuss things, they can organize themselves better. So what happens is glasnost ultimately means that you have increased opposition and allows opposition to get stronger as they can just campaign to some extent, and they can get supporters and grow stronger and stronger and stronger. Additionally, because in order to save money, the Soviet forces based in Eastern Europe pulled back. This sends a message to many in the Eastern Bloc countries that Russia is less inclined to use force to keep them in the Warsaw Pact. And this is going to be disastrous in the future, because what's shortly going to happen is a mass exodus, that means fleeing, of pretty much every Eastern Bloc country in the Warsaw Pact, leaving communism. Now, even from the days of Comecon, with the rise of Stalin, the Eastern Bloc countries have always felt like they've been exploited, and they are. And there is always resentment. No one likes being ruled by a different nation, a different ethnic group. And so however much resistance there was in Russia itself, there was always far more in Poland, Hungary, etc., because they're being ruled by Russians, even if they've got puppets, Polish puppets or Hungarian puppets. And also they are doing far worse economically, because most of their goods and resources are being given to Russia on a discount. So, as a result, these people had to be kept in line through Russian soldiers. Now the problem is, as these people in the Eastern Bloc countries who already don't like Russians and already don't like communism start getting free speech and start seeing life in the West, they start pushing away even faster than anyone in Russia is. And more than that, as soon as they see the Russian soldiers leaving, that only encourages this, these efforts and makes these efforts towards freedom and independence, or maybe even a shift to capitalism, or some sort of shift, greater and greater and greater. Now, what's about to happen is we're going to go through all the major countries, what happens in each country. Because essentially the story is the same. One country there'll be increasing protests, and it comes to a point where the people in charge of that country look at Gorbachev and says, we cannot crack down on these protests. Either you are going to send in Russian tanks, or we're going to lose Poland to the capitalists. And Gorbachev, being Gorbachev, does not want to rule through fear. He does not want to rule through terror, because he knows that only works for 10, 15, 20 years. He's not that man. So he declines. And very quickly, as soon as the people realize the Russians aren't coming, and that they can overwhelm the security forces, they can overwhelm the governments in Poland and Hungary, etc., things get out of hand very quickly with protest, riots, leaders are exiled, in some cases leaders are killed, people against the wall and killed, that's televised in Romania, and independence or freedom or move away from capitalism or elections are held. And in each of the countries the story is the same. The dates are different, the story is the same. Increasing rebellion and protest, and with the rise of glasnost and perestroika. Then we see decision time with Gorbachev, that does he send in tanks, yes or no? He says no, and then it gets out of hand. So, without further ado.
Okay, without further ado, the first country, and probably the most important of the Eastern Bloc countries, was Poland. You'll recall way back at the start of this course, Poland was a #1 issue on Stalin's plate, really. Well, that is, apart from Germany. The issue with Poland was that it's an important, big economic country, but also a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Germany. And keeping Poland solidly in the Eastern Bloc in the Warsaw Pact was incredibly important. By the 1980s, the widespread discontent, largely to do with living conditions. As Mr. Suter said, living standards dropped dramatically in the Eastern Bloc from 1968 forward, but by 1980 in Poland, things like a 5-hour queue for some really lousy sausages, as one example, was pretty much the norm. By the 1980s, Poland, which had been a country that was heavily industrialized in the Eastern Bloc, began to suffer from strikes. A group known as Solidarity, Brotherhood, joins together to become what's known as the Solidarity Movement. In the early 1980s, the Solidarity Movement gains a lot of support, and they start to make relatively large strikes and protests against the Soviet system. By 1981, the Soviets, under Brezhnev at the time, clamped down on the Solidarity Movement. Many of its leaders are arrested. Brezhnev actually forces the country of Poland to make the Solidarity Movement illegal, and the Solidarity Movement is effectively crushed. However, things start to change. By the early part of the 1980s, I believe from 1983 forward, a new pope is elected, and that pope is named Cardinal Lech Wojtyła, who, Cardinal Wojtyła, not Lech, Cardinal Wojtyła becomes Pope John Paul II. And Pope John Paul II becomes an outspoken critic in his masses and in his communications to the Catholic people worldwide of the Eastern system. And Gorbachev and the Soviet leaders of the middle to the late 1980s start to become very concerned about Poland. By 1988, the strikes creep up again. Of course, the Poles are excited about the opportunity of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring, and start to call for a change to their system. Solidarity rears its head again in 1988. This time it's led by a guy named Lech Walesa. And Walesa becomes a very outspoken critic of not only Gorbachev, but the Soviet system. Gorbachev is faced with a very tough decision. Is he going to continue his policies of glasnost and perestroika, and what is he going to do about Poland? Very much realizing that he can't sort of be a hypocrite and turn back on his policies of openness, which he needs to keep communism and certainly the Soviet Union from falling apart. He makes very clear indications to the leaders of the Solidarity Movement in Poland that he will not live up to his commitments in the Brezhnev doctrine. In other words, he will scrap the Brezhnev doctrine and he will not support a clampdown on solidarity. This leads very, very quickly to 1989, where for the first time the Poles hold elections, free elections. You forget that it was agreed in Potsdam and Yalta that there would be free elections, but he does not. So Stalin does not let this happen. In 1989, the Poles hold their first free elections, and they elect a non-communist as the first Eastern European prime minister.
And the thing about everything you're watching and everything you see, because there's all the countries is happening the same thing, is as soon as Poland goes, there is an inspiration for everyone else. Because people are watching, and they're watching basic breaths of tanks being sent in. Is Russia going to come down? And they watch these Polish people unite, protest, and get their freedom. And it only encourages.
Very ironically, when we think back to something we learned before called domino theory, this is domino theory only in reverse on the other side. When one country falls, the other ones fall afterwards.
So, the next part of the story, Hungary, nice and easy. We're going to rattle through these again from textbooks. Exact same thing. Anti-government demonstration increases. There's initial repression, but on the spirit of glasnost, increasingly people are allowed to voice discontent and organise. Eventually gets out of hand. The leadership of Hungary asks Gorbachev for Soviet military support. Gorbachev refuses, and therefore Hungary, in order to stop a revolution happening, accepts that it become a multi-party state with proper elections. And in 1990, the first proper elections, the Democratic Forum, a coalition of non-communist parties, win. A strong message that the people of Hungary want to leave communism.
And again, I'm just going to reinforce a point. You need to understand that by 1988, one of the key things that Gorbachev does to end the Cold War is he gets rid of the Brezhnev doctrine. He will not support governments in clamping down on the freedom of expression of their people with the Soviet military, as the Soviet Union had done in Hungary earlier in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and I suppose to an extent in Afghanistan in 79.
And so you remember asking yourself that these people, the Polish, the Hungarians, are just letting this happen. Well, let's look at a case study when they try and stop this reform. Now, Romania was a particularly brutal terrorist state by Ceausescu.
No, Ceausescu.
Ceausescu.
My resident linguist, Mr. Suter here. Go on. Say something correctly, please. Ceausescu.
And he increasingly just clamps down on protesters, and the protesters get more and more sort of happy to use force, and this in turn means that
Ceausescu
gets to increases his own violence, and in December 1989, the protesters protesting for change are shot by the secret police. This is a real game changer, because it means either you flee and then you never mention this campaign for independence again, or you meet their force with your force. Now,
Ceausescu
makes this worse, because a few days later, he is seen in public. I think it was an operation, I believe it was. When he gets to his stand, he sort of waves the crowd, they boo him in response, in part for this shooting. And he does something critically weak here. Rather than stand there and clamp down and therefore make a show of strength, he flees. And this encourages people that they've got
Ceausescu on the run.
On the run. Hey, see that? Like two horses in a harness together as one. Synergy, that's what this is. This starts the rebellion, and the army, which is made up of peasant conscripts who do not like the state as much as anyone else, side with the people. And there's a fight between the secret police, who know their lives and livelihood will be destroyed if the
Ceausescu
government doesn't win. There's a fight on the street, but obviously the army is going to win. And on the 25th of December,
Ceausescu
is killed on TV by firing squad, and we have something called the National Salvation Front taking over.
You know, just a random aside, I remember very vividly this happening on TV. I was 10 years old. I remember it was Christmas. You could literally watch CNN and see this entire thing happening. It was a communist revolt broadcast in real time. Literally, they played over and over and over the execution of Ceausescu. I remember my father bought, well, actually at the time had a subscription to Time magazine, an American news magazine, and the front page of Time magazine were the bullet-riddled bodies, and I mean, very graphically so, of Ceausescu and his wife in their very expensive clothes after being shot by a firing squad. A rather impromptu firing squad. Effectively, they just captured them, took them up against the wall, and shot them many, many times.
So, the big question, and obviously this same pattern is repeated in Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia, so we're not going to go into too much. Why does Gorbachev let this happen? Remember, at his core, he loves communism, and he wants his countries to stay communist. However, he does not believe in terror. Both he is a moral man, but also he, as a political operator, he understands that you can only keep people in control for terror for only a short period of time. And eventually, all what's going to happen is they will revolt with even more violence. So, it's better to try and loosen control, and if they really want to leave, let them leave, to try and save what is left of the Warsaw Pact and Russia itself. His priority was reforming the system so it can survive. If he sends in troops, it makes glasnost pointless and costs them loads of money, which hurts the perestroika thing. He decides, therefore, if they're going to leave, he is not going to use force. And it's also, as part of his consideration, if he does send in troops, Reagan and all the good deals that are happening, which are saving Russia loads of money, would go back on all these deals and then say, you betrayed us.
Yeah. So things like the INF Treaty would be thrown out the window, the CFE Treaty, and then they're also involved, as you know, in something known as the START talks, this is the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty talks, and these would have all been scrapped had the Soviet Union decided to take a very aggressive approach to stopping these reforms.
And therefore, he believed, and he finally believed, in a modern world where there's going to be improved relations, where there's not this Cold War, where there's not this East versus West, why do you need satellite states, ultimately? Yeah, they're nice to have, but there's no reason why. He doesn't feel like his safety is compromised by losing them, or at least in any meaningful way. So for Gorbachev, it's really a no-brainer. Politically, economically, and just in terms of militarily, he does not need these states. He does not want to pay the high price politically, economically, and militarily that sending troops in will have.
Now this brings us to Germany. You'll know, and you should know at this point, that Germany, of course, is the heart of the Cold War. This is where it all begins. The alliance breaks down over defeating the Nazis, and then Germany is divided in two, and really the division of Europe spreads from Germany. Now, what happens in Germany? A country that is theoretically split by the Berlin Wall. Now, Germany is led by a chancellor named Honecker. He was a strict old-school Marxist. Honecker tries to keep Germany together, but by 1989, with Poland and Hungary and the countries surrounding him starting to fall apart, he is told, after requesting Soviet assistance in controlling this, that he will not get Soviet help. No Soviet soldiers will help him put down unrest. And protests in East Germany especially start to spiral out of control. And actually these protests have their focal point in Berlin. There is at one point on the 4th of November 1989 a 1 million person protest. And these people not only protest in the streets, they all walk to the Berlin Wall, demanding that the Berlin Wall will come down. Knowing that the soldiers won't shoot on them because they don't have Soviet support, the situation in Germany gets out of control. International news media flocks to Berlin, and it becomes a matter of if, not if, but when the wall will come down.
Well, as one of those most glorious, I mean, we'll read through this anyway, but since it follows on quite nicely, the East German government, which obviously replaced Honecker with Krenz, takes over, and they're desperate to try and resolve this situation. They're like Gorbachev. They don't want to be brutal, but they want to keep communism. Okay? However, and one of those beautiful ironies of history is they decide what they're going to do is they're going to allow some refugees with some papers through, so long as they promise to come back. Okay, and it's a fudge, etc., etc. But it's designed to ease the situation, but not open up the borders. The problem is, this is evolving so quickly. They send a message to the local party chief in Berlin, a guy called Günther Schabowski, or something like that, Schabowski, who gets the message and hasn't been briefed about any of this, or updated or explained what to do with it. So it's a really simple message. So he goes to the TV cameras and says, well, yeah, so we're opening up the borders for refugees. And then people are like, the news media is like, hang on, does that mean the borders are open? Like, everything's happening. And there's watch on YouTube, because there's the point where he's going to go, I have no idea. It's on his face. And he goes, yes, yes, immediately. And so then, by that bureaucrat making a wrong decision, just blagging it, essentially, everyone's like, oh, the wall's going down. And so everyone rushes to the wall and demands. So Schabowski said it was, and it's huge, and it really surges the crowds on both sides, all the checkpoints. And the border guards have two choices: shoot all these people who've been told, oh, by the way, yeah, like, go do as you want, who are demanding to go through because they've literally just been told it's on the news, or let them through. And the thing is, no one wants to take responsibility for shooting the crowds. So what ends up happening is some guy, basically, a lieutenant down in one of the checkpoints, goes, you know what, just crack on, and lets them go through. And then because of Günther fluffing his lines, we had, and obviously the Berlin Wall would have come down eventually, but there's something quite nice about the randomness of life. That good old Günther. Watch it on YouTube, look him up. There's just that beautiful, that couple of seconds where he's like, did you think about this?
So by 1990, there's an agreement of all the major powers, Britain, France, the United States, and of course the Soviet Union, that Germany would become a united democratic. Really, the goal of uniting Germany, voiced in something known as Ostpolitik, is realized in 1990. The Berlin Wall comes down, both metaphorically and symbolically. And if you still want to see a piece of the Berlin Wall, go to the Imperial War Museum. Get off the tube at Lambeth North, walk south. It's free, and there's a big chunk of the Berlin Wall there. In fact, you'll see more of it in front of the Imperial War Museum than you'll see in Berlin.
Okay, so obviously this is the same story. the East Germans are not backed up by Russia. They cannot fight their people on their own. This increasing openness makes them realize what life is like, and they're able, therefore, to challenge government, and the government falls. What makes the fall of Berlin significant, because they love this question for some reason, is that it's a symbolic event. The Berlin Wall falling in and of itself doesn't make a huge difference geopolitically.
But it's symbolic of the end of the Iron Curtain.
It is a physical manifestation of the end of the Iron Curtain. And for both on East and West, there was a sense that, no, the Cold War is over now. Or at least it's beginning to die. Over. Okay? So it's really powerful in its symbolism, if not anything else. So, we're going to rattle through a couple of talks. In reality, you can read these in your textbooks. They like asking, describe the key features, questions about them, because people get confused about them. Ultimately, very quickly, after the in this whole period, in sort of 1990s onwards, is because Gorbachev has now given up on the whole Cold War thing, he's giving away anything and everything, ending this, ending that, and so we have a series of very quick talks. The Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, conventional armed forces are non-nuclear armed forces.
Tanks, planes, soldiers with guns. Very real.
Agrees to significant limiting of both sides. This saves the Russians money and the Americans money, because they don't have to have a big army anymore. And so that shows this feeling that, no, I don't think we're going to go to war, let's trust each other and let's
pull our soldiers out.
And this is followed by the START talks.
Yeah, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty talks, 1991. This is really, actually, in many ways, this is building on what was agreed to at SALT II and taking it to the natural next step. This is a massive reduction in nuclear weapons. They set a 7-year period to remove 1,600 strategic nuclear warhead vehicles, 6,000 warheads, and a limit of 4,900 ballistic missiles in total placed on what each country can hold. Overall, this is about a 25 to 30% reduction in strategic warheads, and it's a massive, in fact, this is by far the largest reduction in nuclear weapons ever. And this is very much symbolic that we do not need these nuclear weapons anymore. Let's destroy them. In fact, both Gorbachev and then who signs it is the predecessor to Reagan, George Bush Sr., actually signed the START Treaty with pens made up of broken down nuclear weapons. So the pens that they use are actually made of nuclear weapons.
Poetic. Yes. So, this change in the background, and this is evidence of Gorbachev is into the Cold War in a militaristic sense, is capped off. And you could argue maybe as time goes on there will be more and more talks. But very quickly, after the Warsaw Pact, countries go away, it becomes Russia's turn to implode and communists to be pushed away. Now, the story is the same as it is in Eastern Europe. The decline in censorship, the rise in foreign travel, increasingly makes people question the corruption and the fact that living standards are so clearly different and better in the West than they are in the East. This leads to a rise of people wanting change. But because there's no censorship, they can now agitate the change. They can talk to their neighbours about how they want change. They can write books about how they want change. And that only encourages more people to want change. Gorbachev, as in before, does not want to clamp down on this because and therefore that only encourages Eastern European countries and also encourages people within Russia to agitate for more change. Gorbachev does not want these Eastern European countries to go. He does not want the Soviet Union to break down, but he doesn't want his force to maintain it. And so, much like the peripheral parts of the Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe start to break away, once that starts happening, the Soviet republics, remember the United USSR is loads of different ethnic groups, Soviets all stuck together.
The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
There you go.
All of those little republics start to break away.
It's a union of them, that's who's their name. Anyway, so Estonia, Latvia start saying that they want to break away, and again, Gorbachev can't use force, and this is all encouraged by the same things, and so therefore they start making moves to move away. In August 1991, there's a coup, and that's an attempt by the military forces to take over the government by the hardline communists in the KGB and some in the army as well. Essentially, there's a lot of shelling of the of various government buildings. We don't need to go into much detail, but essentially, this is the last gasp attempt of communists and real hardline Stalinist-style communists who have a lovely life under this system because they do quite well out of this. They get all the best plum jobs, etc., to stop what they see as the mortal decline, the end of the Soviet Union. Now, Gorbachev, in response, with popular support and most of the army stay on his side, fights off, and in response allows more democracy to balance them out, to try and stop these people having too much power. This is particularly on local level democracy. There's lots of elections local level, and that starts again makes local level states break away, but also increasingly means people start discussing politics, get involved in politics, and then start discussing perhaps we don't want communism.
Yeah.
And then essentially what has happened is there's enough agitation that we need national elections, not regional elections, national elections. Gorbachev does not want this. He hates this in that he fears it will get rid of communism, but he thinks we cannot clamp down on this. The best we can do is compete in elections and try and get voted in again. Unfortunately, people had had enough of communism. They didn't know what life was like under capitalism. Actually, interestingly, the support for communism nowadays in Russia is going up. And so therefore they vote a guy called Boris Yeltsin, who made his name not as a massive anti-communist, but seriously not as a member of the Communist Party, to take over the country. And the saddest image, and if you're in my class, you would have already seen this, that you can associate Gorbachev, a man who cared deeply about communism and gave in everything because he didn't want to kill his fellow countrymen, he therefore doesn't have a job, and he's reduced in 1993, 1994 to starring in a Pizza Hut advert in order to pay the bills. Like, look on YouTube. Like, that is not a man he looks happy in the advert, but he needs to look happy in the advert. he's
a man who's about to eat some of the worst and most greasy pan pizza money can buy.
What else could summarize your failure as a communist? Working in a pizza advert. Anyway, and that was the end of the Soviet Union.
So why did the USSR fail? There are the long-term factors.
But this is a very favorite question of theirs.
Yeah, then these are the long-term factors, and these are very important. Obviously, there's economic stagnation. The Soviet economy did not grow, whereas the U.S. economy was growing at a very, very rapid rate. Also, too, that the USSR and the system set up by Comecon effectively meant that it was exploitative, which meant that the USSR took from its satellite states, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, for instance, all of the best benefits of their economy. They took their industry, they took the raw materials, and they shipped it back to the Soviet Union. This disproportionately helped the Soviet Union, but hurt the Eastern Bloc countries, which made them more akin to rebellion rising up against them. But at the same time, too, it also meant that the USSR did not go and develop its economy more well-roundedly. They depended on the Czechs overwhelmingly for industrial production of things like heavy industry engines and so forth. And the Soviet Union's had a very unbalanced economy. And overall, this was very, very unhealthy.
Just something to note on those, the effect of this economic stagnation and the effect of this exploitation means that the living standards and the quality of life of the average Russian, the average Polish person, is significantly below the West. And that's why, as soon as you allow people to see what life is like in the West, everyone looks at their terrible cars, terrible clothes, they look in the West, and they go, hang on, we're not winning, are we?
No. And then you couple that with some short-term factors. Of course, there was Ronald Reagan's aggressive policy. The massive increases of government spending on arms forced the Soviet Union to match this. This is highlighted greatly by something like Star Wars, SDI. Also, Reagan increases the tension and the threat in the Cold War and really pushes the Soviets to the brink, not to mention the fact that he keeps the Soviets embroiled in the next point, the Afghanistan war, by spending millions upon millions of dollars supporting anti-Soviet forces, the Mujahideen, which keep the Soviets embroiled in a very, very expensive war, which for the long-term factors they can't afford, which doesn't end until 1989, and this drives the Soviet economy further into the tank. By the middle of the 1980s, you have, of course, Mikhail Gorbachev and his policies very much to change and try and save the Soviet economy of glasnost and perestroika, which send the message to the satellite states that there's openness and a potential for reform or a potential for change, which of course leads to open rebellion in Poland and then the domino effect in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, etc., etc. And then, of course, within those states, there was the repressed nationalism, the repressive Stalinist policies of a lot of the leaders that the communists put into these Eastern European countries could no longer hold the fort once the Brezhnev doctrine was down. And the nationalist sentiment that had just always been under the surface, but very, very well repressed by the communist state, bubbles to the fore. And of course, many of the movements such as Solidarity in Poland or the movement in Hungary is very much nationalistic. We want freedom. We want to run ourselves. And ultimately, the Soviet Union by 1989 and 1990 cannot cope with all of these factors working together, and the USSR falls. By 1991, as announced at a summit in Malta, George W. Bush, standing next to Mikhail Gorbachev, announced that the Cold War is over, and thus, so is your course.
A quick note before we go, everyone finds the Cold War course harder than Russia and even harder than Britain in many cases. It's not necessarily the case. Actually, you know what you're going to be asked for most things. What makes it hard is there's lots of stuff. You need to make sure in your revision that you learn the timeline and learn the story. Once you learn the story and break it into chunks, 1945 to 1953, start the Cold War, the four crises, 1953, oh no, 1955 technically, 1955 to 1968. Then détente, 1968 to 1980, and then end of the Cold War, 1980 to the end. Each of those chunks, every question, every idea is, why does it start? What happens in the crises? Why was there détente? Why did it end?
And not only that, does that period and do the things that happen in that period of time make relations between the USA and the USSR better or worse?
In your notes, every event, particularly every major event, have 2 to 3 bullet points of what can I say if I got asked about why this is significant, what 2 or 3 things make this significant, and have 2 or 3 comments about how it makes relations worse. Because in this essay, in this thing, if you just say, oh, it makes it worse because they're now rivals, welcome to Seatown.
Yeah.
Okay? You need to have quality
What does
things.
that rivalry look like? Why are they rivals? How long will they be rivals for? And does this make a rivalry that already existed worse?
The more detail you have in your notes, the better.
That's all for me, Mr. Rain. It's been a pleasure.
It's the last one, isn't it?
Yeah. On to Britain, Unit 3.
Wonderful.
Take care.